Margaret Williams sat quietly in the busy airport terminal. Her old hands rested on her simple black handbag. At 72 years old, she had learned to be patient through many hard times in her life. Her grey hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a blue sweater that was getting old but still clean and tidy. The airport was crowded and noisy. People rushed past her with their suitcases, talking loudly on their phones. Margaret waited calmly in her seat, watching all the activity around her. She had been looking forward to this trip for months. She was going to visit her daughter, and nothing could dampen her excitement. "Next," shouted the gate agent from behind the counter. The young woman did not even look up from her computer screen when she called out. Margaret stood up slowly and walked to the counter. Her joints were stiff from sitting, but she moved with quiet dignity. She held her boarding pass in her hand and approached the desk with a gentle smile. "Hello, dear," Margaret said politely. "I believe there might be a mistake with my seat assignment." The gate agent finally looked up. Her name tag said Jessica in bold letters. When she saw Margaret, she rolled her eyes in an obvious way that made Margaret feel uncomfortable. "What's the problem now?" Jessica asked in a tired, annoyed voice. Margaret showed her boarding pass to Jessica. "Well, I had booked seat 1-A when I made my reservation. But this boarding pass says 3-3. That's quite far back in the plane, isn't it?" Jessica let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She looked at Margaret as if she was wasting her time. "Look, lady, the flight is completely full today. Someone with frequent flyer status needed that seat. You'll just have to take what you get." Margaret felt disappointed. She had specifically chosen a seat closer to the front so she could get off the plane more easily. But she did not want to cause any trouble for the busy airline workers. "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "Thank you for your help." As Margaret walked away from the counter, she heard Jessica talking to another worker behind her. "These old people think they're entitled to everything," Jessica muttered loud enough for Margaret to hear. Margaret felt her cheeks turn red with embarrassment, but she kept walking. She found an empty seat near the gate and sat down carefully. She pulled out her old phone and typed a message to her daughter. "Hello, sweetheart. Having a bit of trouble with my flight, but nothing I can't handle. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. All my love, Mom." The response came back very quickly. "So sorry to hear that, Mom. Which airline are you flying with? I might be able to help." Margaret smiled softly as she typed back, "British Airways, dear. But please don't worry yourself. I know you're busy with work." She put her phone away and waited patiently. The flight was delayed for 3 long hours. Margaret watched other passengers get angry and complain loudly to the staff. But she just sat quietly, reading a book she had brought with her. When boarding finally began, Margaret made her way slowly to the back of the plane. She had to squeeze past many frustrated passengers in the narrow aisle. Her small carry-on bag felt heavy in her hands. The flight attendant was a stern-looking woman named Helen. She watched Margaret struggle with her bag but did not offer to help. Margaret was breathing hard from the effort of walking down the long aisle. "Excuse me," Margaret said politely to Helen. "Could you please help me with this bag?" Helen looked very annoyed. "Can't you see I'm busy? Just shove it anywhere it fits." Margaret felt hurt by the rude response, but she did not complain. She managed to lift the bag into the overhead compartment by herself. Even though it clearly caused her pain, her arthritis made lifting difficult, but she did not want to bother anyone. She settled into her cramped seat in the very back row. On one side of her was a crying baby, and on the other side was a man who immediately started complaining about the noise. "This is ridiculous," the man said loudly. I pay good money for this seat and have to sit next to screaming kids and, well, people who probably got discount tickets. Margaret felt her face burn with embarrassment again. But she remained silent. She had raised her daughter to be strong in difficult situations. And she would show that same strength now, daughter. Plane took off. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about her daughter Emma. Her brilliant girl had worked so hard to build her career in the aviation industry. Margaret was so proud of everything Emma had accomplished, even though she did not fully understand all the business details. When the meal service began, Margaret watched as the flight attendant served dinner to all the passengers round her tray. Table remained empty. She waited patiently, thinking they would get to her soon. After everyone else had been served, Margaret gently pressed the call button above her seat. Helen appeared, looking irritated. "What do you want?" Helen asked impatiently. "I'm sorry, too." "Bother you?" Margaret said apologetically. "But I think my meal was missed." "We ran out of meals," Helen said curtly. "That's what happens when you're sitting in the back." Margaret's stomach rumbled with hunger, but she simply smiled. "That's quite all right, dear. These things happen." Despite the poor treatment, Margaret remained kind and gracious. She helped the mother with the crying baby, offering her own tissues and speaking softly to calm the child. She even shared the crackers she had brought in her purse with other hungry passengers, without the crew knowing. Margaret quietly took a photo of her boarding pass and her empty tray table. She sent another message to her daughter. "Such interesting customer service today. Sweetheart, I'm learning so much about the airline industry. The flight finally landed 2 hours late." Margaret gathered her things slowly, her arthritis making every movement difficult. As she shuffled off the plane, she overheard Helen talking to Jessica at the gate. "Thank goodness that's over," Helen said with relief. "I swear, these old economy passengers are the worst. They expect 5-star service for budget prices." Margaret paused for just a moment when she heard these words, then continued walking toward the exit. She had something very important to do tomorrow. The next morning, Margaret woke up in her small hotel room feeling very tired but still determined. She had been looking forward to this trip for many months. Today was the day she would finally see her daughter Emma after being apart for 6 long months. But before she could enjoy her visit, she had to deal with a big problem. Her suitcase had not arrived with her flight yesterday. Margaret got dressed in the same clothes she had worn on the plane. She felt uncomfortable wearing the same outfit, but she had no choice. All her clean clothes were in the missing suitcase at the airport baggage claim office. Margaret stood in a long line for 1 full hour. The office was busy and noisy. Many other passengers were also there with problems about their luggage. Margaret waited patiently, shifting from one foot to the other as her legs began to ache. When she finally reached the front of the line, she saw the same person from yesterday behind the counter. It was Jessica, the gate agent who had been so rude to her. "You again?" Jessica said with clear annoyance in her voice. "What's the problem now?" Margaret tried to stay polite despite feeling hurt by Jessica's tone. "My suitcase didn't arrive on yesterday's flight. I was wondering if you could help me track it down." Jessica barely looked at the baggage claim ticket that Margaret handed her. She glanced at it for just a second before pushing it back across the counter. "Lost luggage happens all the time," Jessica said in a bored voice. "Fill out this form, and we'll call you in a few days." Margaret felt worried. A few days. "But I need my medications that were in the suitcase. And I brought special gifts for my daughter that I made myself." Jessica interrupted her rudely. "Look, Grandma, I don't make the rules round here. The form is all I can do for you." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. but she tried hard to hold them back. She did not want to cry in front of this unkind woman. "Could I please speak to your supervisor?" Margaret asked quietly. Jessica actually laughed at this request. "He's in a meeting right now. Besides, he'll tell you exactly the same thing I just did." Margaret took the form with hands that were shaking slightly. She was very upset because her suitcase contained important things. She had packed her late husband's gold watch to give to Emma as a special gift. There were also homemade cookies she had baked with love, and a photo album filled with family memories. Now, all of these precious items were lost somewhere in the airline system. As Margaret walked away from the counter, she heard Jessica talking on the phone to someone. "Yeah, some old woman complaining about her bags," Jessica said loudly. "These people act like we're miracle workers or something." Margaret felt her heart sink even lower. She found a quiet corner and sat down to fill out the lost luggage form. Her hands were still shaking as she wrote. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma. "Can't wait to see you, Mom. I've planned a special lunch for us at your favorite restaurant. How was your flight?" Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. She did not want to worry her daughter with complaints. Emma worked so hard and was so successful. Margaret typed back carefully. "Wonderful, darling. Your airline certainly has interesting staff. I'm learning so much about customer service." At the same time, across the city at British Airways headquarters, Emma Williams was sitting in her large office. She was the CEO of the airline. Though her mother did not know all the details of her important position, Emma was reviewing customer service reports on her computer for the past 5 years. Emma had worked 16-hour days to turn the struggling airline round. Her main focus had always been on treating every passenger with dignity and respect. She believed that good customer service was the most important thing for any airline. There was a knock on her office door. "Ma'am," her assistant said as she entered, "your mother's flight yesterday was delayed. I thought you should know." Emma looked up from her computer with concern. Was she taken care of properly? "I specifically asked you to make sure she was comfortable during her trip. I tried calling the crew to check on her, but they said everything was handled normally." Emma felt a strange feeling of worry. Her mother's text messages had seemed oddly formal. The way Margaret mentioned the airline seemed careful, as if she was trying not to say something negative. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at the restaurant, where she was meeting Emma. Despite her exhausting and upsetting experience, her face immediately lit up with joy when she saw her daughter waiting for her. "Mum." Emma jumped up and hugged her tightly. "You look tired. How's the flight really?" Margaret hesitated. She had raised Emma to be strong and independent. She did not want to burden her successful daughter with her own problems and complaints. It was fine, dear, Margaret said. Just the usual travel challenges that happen sometimes. But Emma knew her mother very well. She could see something was wrong in Margaret's eyes and the way she was holding herself. "Mum, what really happened? And don't say nothing because I can see it in your eyes." Margaret sighed deeply. "Well, there were a few small issues during the trip, but nothing I couldn't handle on my own." "What kind of issues?" Emma asked with growing concern. "The gate agent was a bit stressed and busy, and the flight attendants seemed very rushed. And my luggage seems to have taken a different holiday than I did." Emma's jaw tightened with anger. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mum." As Margaret reluctantly shared all the details of her terrible experience, Emma's expression grew darker and more serious. This was not just poor service. This was discrimination against an elderly passenger. This was everything Emma had worked so hard to prevent in her airline. "Mum, I need to ask you something important," Emma said. Did you get the names of the staff members who treated you this way? Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Emma the photo she had taken. I took her. Picture of my boarding pass. The gate agent was named Jessica, and the flight attendant was Helen. But please don't make a big fuss about this, dear. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. Emma took her mother's hands in hers. Mum, you are not causing trouble. They're the ones causing trouble. That evening, Emma sat alone in her office long after all the other workers had gone home. The building was quiet and empty. She stared at her computer screen, reading the crew reports from her mother's flight the day before. According to the official records that the flight crew had written, everything had gone perfectly. The reports said there were no complaints from passengers, no incidents during the flight, and no problems at all. But Emma knew this was not true. She opened the staff files for Jessica and Helen on her computer. Both women had been working for the airline for over 3 years. As Emma read through Jessica's file, she found several customer complaints about her bad attitude toward passengers. However, these complaints had been dismissed by management as isolated incidents that did not represent a pattern. Helen's file looked clean at first glance, but Emma noticed something interesting. Helen had been assigned to work only in economy class for the past 6 months. This was usually a sign that a flight attendant had caused problems in first-class service and had been moved to the back of a plane as a form of punishment. Emma's phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed it was her mother. Double quotes, "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret's voice came through the phone. "I hope I'm not calling too late. It's never too late for you to call, Mum." Emma replied warmly. "How are you feeling after today?" "Much better. After our nice lunch together." Margaret said, "I just wanted to call and say something important. I'm so proud of what you've built with the airline. I know it wasn't easy for you." Emma felt a lump forming in her throat. Her mother's words touched her deeply. "You know, Mum, I learned everything about treating people with respect from watching you. When Dad died and we had almost no money, you still treated everyone with kindness and dignity." Emma continued, "Do you remember Mrs. Peterson who lived next door to us? She was so rude to us because we couldn't afford to fix our broken fence. She made nasty comments about our yard and our old car. Oh, I remember her very well," Margaret said softly. "But even though she was mean to us, you still brought her homemade soup when she was sick with the flu. You taught me that how we treat other people says everything about who we are as human beings." Margaret was quiet for a moment before responding. "That's exactly why I'm so proud of you, Emma. You've built something that really matters in this world." "Have I, though?" Emma asked with doubt in her voice. "After what happened to you yesterday?" "I'm not so sure anymore. One bad experience doesn't define your entire airline, dear," Margaret said gently. "But it shouldn't happen at all, Mum, especially not to someone like you." The next morning, Emma arrived at her office very early. Before the sun had fully risen, she immediately called James Mitchell, her head of operations. "James, I need you to pull all the security footage from yesterday's flight to 147, Emma said, urgently. "I want to see the gate area, the boarding process, and the cabin service. Is there a problem, Emma?" James asked with concern. "There might be a serious problem." "I also need you to quietly review the service records for a gate agent, Jessica Williams, and flight attendant Helen Thompson. Don't let anyone know what you're doing. I'll get right on it. Can I ask what this is about?" Emma paused before answering. "Let's just say I received some feedback about passenger treatment that concerns me greatly." While James worked on gathering the footage, Emma made another important phone call. She called Mary Davies, her head of customer service, Mary. "I want to implement something completely new," Emma said. "Anonymous quality checks on our customer service. But I want real passengers doing the checking, not corporate inspectors. That's a brilliant idea." Mary replied enthusiastically. "How would it work exactly?" "I'm thinking we could have mystery passengers, people who look like regular travelers, but are actually reporting back to us about their experience with our staff. I love this concept. When do you want to start this program?" Emma looked at a framed photo on her desk. It showed her and her mother at her graduation from business school. Her mother had been so proud that day, wearing her best dress and beaming with joy. "Let's start immediately," Emma said with determination. That afternoon, James knocked on Emma's office door. He looked serious and uncomfortable. "I have the footage you requested," James said as he entered. "And Emma, you're not going to like what you see." Emma watched the security videos in complete silence. Her face grew more and more angry as she saw what had happened to her mother. She saw her mother being dismissed rudely at the gate by Jessica. She watched her mother being ignored during the boarding process when she needed help with her bag. She saw Helen treating her mother with obvious disdain and disrespect during the flight. Most upsetting of all, she saw the empty tray table where her mother's meal should have been. Her mother had paid for that meal but never received it. But Emma also saw something else that made her proud. She saw her mother helping other passengers even though she was being treated poorly. She saw her mother offering tissues to a woman with a crying baby. She saw her mother sharing her own crackers with hungry passengers round her. "There's more," James said quietly. "I found Jessica's complete personnel file. She's had 12 formal complaints in the past year about being rude to elderly passengers. And Helen has been transferred between departments 3 times for a similar attitude problems." Emma closed her laptop and stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the planes preparing for departure on the runway. "Below, James, I want you to schedule a mandatory training session for all customer service staff," Emma said firmly. "Tomorrow morning. Make sure Jessica and Helen are both there." "What should I tell them the meeting is about?" James asked. Emma turned back to face him with a look of determination in her eyes. "Tell them it's about remembering why we're here. We're here to serve our passengers, not to judge them." "And if they ask who complained about their service," Emma's expression became even more serious, "tell them they'll find out everything tomorrow." The next morning, Emma stood outside the large conference room where 30 airline staff members were slowly gathering for the meeting. She could hear the usual chatter and conversation through the closed door. People were wondering out loud why they had been called to this emergency meeting so early in the morning. Some workers were speculating about possible layoffs or major policy changes. Others wondered if the airline was in financial trouble. The tone of their voices showed they were worried and confused about the sudden meeting. Inside the room, Jessica sat near the back, checking her phone and scrolling through social media. She seemed relaxed and unconcerned about the meeting. Helen was chatting casually with other flight attendants about their weekend plans and what they had done for fun. Neither Jessica nor Helen suspected that their actions from 2 days ago were about to change everything in their lives. They had no idea that their treatment of an elderly passenger was the reason for this emergency gathering. Emma took a deep breath and entered the room. The moment she walked through the door, all conversations stopped immediately. The room became completely quiet as everyone turned to look at her. Emma was known throughout the airline as a fair but demanding boss. She was someone who had worked her way up from the ground crew, starting at the very bottom of the company. Because of this experience, she understood every single job in the airline and knew how hard each position could be. "Thank you for coming this morning," Emma began, her voice calm but very serious. I want to talk to you about something that happened 2 days ago on Flight 247. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat when she heard the flight number. Helen looked up from her coffee cup. Suddenly paying attention, we pride ourselves on excellent customer service at this airline. Emma continued, "We always say that we treat every passenger with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or what class they are flying in. But I've recently learned that sometimes we fall far short of that promise." Emma picked up her remote control and clicked it. The first video appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. It showed the gate area, with Margaret slowly approaching Jessica's counter. I want you all to watch this interaction between our gate agent and a passenger. Emma said. The room watched in very uncomfortable silence as the video played. They saw Jessica dismiss Margaret rudely, roll her eyes in an obvious way, and make rude comments to her colleague. Several staff members glanced over at Jessica, who had gone completely pale and looked like she might be sick. This passenger, Emma continued, is a 72-year-old woman who was traveling alone to visit her daughter. She was polite, patient, and asked very reasonable questions about her seat assignment. Emma clicked the remote again. The next video showed the boarding process, with Margaret struggling with her heavy bag while Helen completely ignored her requests for help. Here we see our flight attendant refusing to assist an elderly passenger with her carry-on luggage. The passenger managed to lift the bag herself, despite having obvious difficulty and pain. Helen sank lower and lower in her chair, trying to make herself invisible. She could feel other employees looking at her with shock and disapproval. The final video showed the meal service during the flight. Margaret sat with an empty tray table while everyone round her received their food and ate their meals. And here, we see the same passenger being denied a meal that she had paid for, with no explanation or apology from her staff. Emma said. The room was now completely silent. Emma could see the shock and embarrassment on many faces throughout the room. Some employees looked angry about what they were seeing. I want you all to know, Emma said, her voice growing stronger and more emotional, that this passenger handled this terrible treatment with remarkable grace and dignity. She helped other passengers round her, shared her own food with hungry travelers, and never once raised her voice or demanded special treatment. Emma paused for a long moment, letting the weight of her words sink into everyone's minds. The silence in the room was heavy and uncomfortable. She also happens to be my mother, Emma said quietly. The gasp that went through the room was loud and audible. Jessica looked like she might faint from shock. Helen put her head in her hands, clearly ashamed of her behavior. Margaret Williams is not just my mother, Emma continued, her voice becoming more emotional. She's also the woman who worked 2 jobs to put me through business school when we had no money. She's the woman who gave me the loan to start this airline when no bank would even look at my business plan. She's the woman who taught me that how we treat other people is the most important thing about who we are as human beings. Emma's voice cracked slightly as she continued, and most importantly, she's exactly the kind of passenger we should be honored to serve. She's someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She's a person who deserves respect regardless of whether she's flying first class or economy class, regardless of whether she's my mother or a complete stranger. Jessica suddenly stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face. Ms. Williams, I had no idea who she was. I'm so very sorry. Are you sorry because she's my mother? Emma asked sharply. Or are you sorry because you treated another human being poorly? Both. Jessica stammered. I'm sorry because it was completely wrong, not just because of who she is. Helen also stood up, her face red with shame. I don't have any excuse for my behavior. I was having a bad day, but that's no reason to treat any passenger that way. I'm deeply ashamed of myself." Emma looked round the room at all the faces staring. Back at her. "I'm not telling you this story to embarrass Jessica and Helen. I'm telling you because this kind of attitude exists throughout our airline, and it needs to change completely. Starting today, 3 months later, Margaret sat in the same airport terminal where her difficult journey had begun. But this time, everything round her was completely different. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," said the gate agent behind the counter. He was a young man named Thomas who had been hired after Emma's new training program was put in place. "I see you're traveling to Edinburgh today. How can I make your journey more comfortable?" Margaret smiled warmly at the friendly greeting. Just having a friendly face to talk to makes all the difference in the world. "Dear," Thomas looked at his computer screen and typed for a moment. "Well, I've upgraded you to our premium economy section with extra legroom at no charge, and I've made sure the flight crew knows you might need assistance with your carry-on bag." "That's very thoughtful of you," Margaret said. "But I don't need any special treatment." Thomas smiled genuinely. "Ma'am, this isn't special treatment at all. This is exactly how we treat all our passengers now." As Margaret walked down the jet bridge to board the plane, she felt nervous about seeing the flight crew. She wondered if they would remember her from the terrible experience 3 months ago. As she stepped onto the aircraft, she was greeted by Helen. This was the same flight attendant who had been so rude and dismissive during her previous flight. "Mrs. Williams," Helen said with genuine warmth in her voice. "It's absolutely wonderful to see you again. I've prepared a special seat for you with easy access to the restroom. And I wanted to personally apologize again for my terrible behavior on your previous flight." Margaret reached out and took Helen's hands in hers. "You've already apologized. Many times, dear. What matters most is what you've learned from that experience. I've learned so much," Helen said with emotion in her voice. "I've learned that every passenger has their own story and their own struggles. Every person deserves kindness and respect, no matter what. Your daughter's training program completely changed my whole perspective on this job." During the flight, Margaret watched carefully as the crew interacted with all the other passengers round her. She saw them helping an elderly man take his medication at the right time. She watched them patiently answering many questions from a nervous first-time flyer who was afraid of flying. She saw them going out of their way to make a young child's birthday special by bringing him a small cake and singing to him. At one point during the meal service, she overheard a passenger complaining very loudly about the food that had been served to him. "Sir," the flight attendant said in a calm and understanding voice, "I completely understand that you're disappointed with your meal. Let me see what other food options we have available for you. And please, let me know if there's anything else I can do to improve your flying experience today." Margaret felt tears of pride forming in her eyes as she watched this interaction. This was exactly the kind of airline that Emma had always dreamed of creating from the very beginning. When the plane finally landed safely, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "How was your flight today, Mom?" Margaret smiled as she typed back her response. "Perfect, darling. Your crew was absolutely wonderful to everyone. I'm so proud of what you've built with this airline." Emma's response came back very quickly. "I learned everything from the best teacher. Thank you for teaching me that every person matters and deserves respect." Later that evening, Emma sat in her office at the airline's headquarters. She was reviewing the latest customer service reports that had come in. The numbers were amazing. Customer complaints were down by 80% compared to the previous year. Customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high in the company's history. But more importantly than the numbers, Emma was receiving personal letters from passengers thanking the airline for treating them with dignity and respect during their travels. One letter that arrived that day particularly moved Emma's heart. She read it several times. "Dear British Airways, I'm a 78-year-old woman who flies several times a year to visit my grandchildren who live far away for many years. I dreaded flying because of how airline staff often treated elderly passengers like me. We were often ignored, dismissed, or treated like we were a burden. But my recent experience with your airline was so completely different from anything I had experienced before. Your crew member, Helen, went out of her way to help me with my bags and made sure I was comfortable throughout the entire flight. She even remembered that I mentioned it was my grandson's birthday and helped me surprise him with a special announcement over the airplane speakers for the first time in years. I felt like a valued passenger instead of a burden. Thank you for reminding me that there are still kind and caring people in this world who remember that we are all human beings deserving of respect." Emma wiped away a tear as she finished reading the letter. She picked up her phone and called her mother. "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret answered on the first ring. "Mom, I just wanted to call and say thank you. Not just for what you taught me about treating people with kindness, but for how you handled the terrible experience with such grace and dignity. You could have been angry or demanded special treatment because you're my mother, but instead, you showed me exactly who we should be as a company. You know, Emma," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about that awful flight experience. In some ways, I'm actually grateful it happened. Grateful." "Why would you be grateful for such poor treatment?" "Because it reminded me that I raised a daughter who stands up for what's right, and because it helped you create something truly beautiful. An airline where everyone is treated with the kindness and respect they deserve." Emma smiled through her tears. "I love you so much, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. And I'm proud of you every single day." As Emma hung up the phone, she looked out her office window at the planes preparing for their evening departures. Each aircraft carried passengers with their own stories, their own hopes, and their own families waiting for them at their destinations. And thanks to one woman's grace under pressure and another's determination to create change, each passenger would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The end.